Oh, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. Hope everyone enjoyed lunch. We're looking forward to another great session this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Diana Strassman, who will tell us about our next speakers. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay, great, great. Well, I'm really happy to introduce our final panel, looking forward, creating a more just society. And I'm especially glad to be introducing this. As many of you know, I direct the program here at Rice on poverty, justice, and human capabilities. And that is really the orientation of all that our program is focused on. As many of you can tell, I am recovering from laryngitis, so I will not speak long, but extra time for the speakers. So I'll give just a nutshell introduction. With this panel, we think about where would we like technology to take us? In asking this question, it's important to remember that technology is a means towards where we would like to go, to a future where all people, and some would argue that we should add all life, to a place where they are better able to flourish. What that means and how we might approach these questions is the subject of our next three panelists, who address different facets of these issues. Alex Byrd, Professor of History and Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, will be speaking about facing a history of racism. Rodrigo Ferreira, in computer ethics, will be speaking about what do we mean by tech ethics. And Ruth Lopez-Turley, Professor of Sociology and Director of the Kinder Institute, will be speaking on creating a more just society through research. I'd like to raise a few questions that this panel will consider, and then I will hand it over. For any policy approach, it is important to consider who benefits and who gets to decide. What is the role of power dynamics in institutional, political, and economic structures? If our goal is truly oriented towards justice, how do we move forward in a way that doesn't recreate these structures? How can we decolonize knowledge and policies, and can technology help further these goals rather than simply reinscribe them? I teach all of my students how to edit Wikipedia, as this is one repository of knowledge that is freely accessible to all who have access to a computer. It is also editable by all, as middle school teachers would like to remind their students. But most people don't know how to do it, and Wikipedia itself is edited by those with access to technology and privileged knowledge. Interestingly, the most contested articles are those that best reflect the status of the most respected research and evidence. Still, the vast majority of articles are on topics that reflect the interests of those who participate on Wikipedia, and there are comparatively few on topics related to justice and ethics. Yet another example of the ways in which technology fails those with the least access to it. Still, I soldier on in my efforts to diversify the participants in Wikipedia, and I hope to recruit some of you to join me. More generally, however, in the face of the growing impacts of technological change, including climate change and many other facets, the real question remains that these speakers will address: how can we better center the lives of the less powerful? What is the role and responsibility of the scholar, of our institutions and policies? And I'm going to leave it at that and turn the chair over to Professor Byrd.
Thank you, Diana, for that introduction, and thank all of you for being here. It is a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak with you all today. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak with your colleagues. So here we go. These are Gloria Richardson's eyes. Her eyes, I think, are an appropriate place to start a discussion around what it means to face a history of racism. Richardson was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1922, part of a black family with deep roots in the state. They were business owners in Cambridge, Maryland, about 100 miles from DC. She attended Howard University in the 1930s, and while there, participated in protests against a nearby drugstore about its hiring practices. The drugstore served the students at Howard University, which is a historically black, comprehensive research university in Washington, D.C. The drugstore served the students at Howard University, but did not hire black folk. And so Richardson was part of a group of students who thought better of that and protested. She also pushed for more equitable practices on her campus and in her sorority. Come the 1960s, Richardson was living in Cambridge, Maryland with her family. She was a divorced mother with 2 children. And her children, one of her daughters, became active in protest in Cambridge against unequal access to public facilities in their town. Richardson didn't like the ways that the police officers in town were responding to the young protesters. And so she joined the movement out of 2 concerns. Out of concerns for her children, and out of concerns for the ways that black people in Cambridge were being treated. The subsequent battles in Cambridge, the protest and the arrest, because they took place so close to the nation's seat of power, focused a lot of national attention. Richardson says of her work then and thereafter, racism is ingrained in this country. This goes on and on. Racism is ingrained in this country. We can say that here. I'm so happy to say it. I'm happy to be able to say it. I'm going to say it a 3rd time. Racism is ingrained in this country. I don't know if my kids can hear that in school anymore. Imagine people passing a law that says we're not going to talk about gravity in school anymore. We're going to do science. We're going to do physics. But you can't actually talk about gravity. Okay, back to Richardson. You can't do the history of this country unless you come to terms with that fact. We marched until the governor called martial law, said Richardson. That's when you get their attention. Otherwise, you're going to keep protesting the same things another 100 years from now. The younger folks around Gloria remember, Gloria didn't give a damn what you said about her. She wasn't impressed with King, Martin Luther King Jr., Kennedy, either of the Kennedys, or anybody else. She considered herself to be as good as those guys, if not better. And she said of the difficulties of working in the Cambridge protests, I wasn't afraid, I was upset. And if I was upset enough, I didn't have time to be afraid. And besides, we had guns too. Now, the Cambridge protests went on and on for several years. And late in the protests, federal officials, Robert Kennedy in particular, pushed for a truce to the protests. He wanted the folks to agree to hold a plebiscite concerning equal access. Richardson and others, by that time, many activists from around the country had headed to Cambridge, particularly young people with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. Richardson and others urged caution about this vote. Said Richardson, a first-class citizen does not beg for freedom. A first-class citizen does not plead to the white power structure to give him something that the whites have no power to give and no power to take away. Human rights are human rights, not white rights. Richardson participated in the Cambridge marches from 1962 all the way into 1964. You can read about Richardson in Joseph Fitzgerald's The Struggle is Eternal. That's another fact. Gloria Richardson and Black Liberation. And maybe before that, you can consider starting with Keith Alexander's 2020 Washington Post profile, Gloria Richardson, now 98. She wants the new generation to fight on. I wanted to start with Richardson because of the ways that her story enlivens, enriches, and challenges traditional American civil rights narrative. Now, Cambridge, Maryland is Southern enough, but it's not the Piney Woods. It's not Deep South. Richardson was surely a prophet, but she was not a preacher. At the height of her powers, she was not a blazing 20-something, but a blazing 40-something, divorced mother of 2 children. She was a woman and a civil rights warrior. And even though there's great power in peace and nonviolent direct action, I believe that. Even though there's great power in those traditions, if you hit Gloria Richardson, she just might hit you back harder. Facing a history of racism, I'll hold today, requires an understanding of the nature and scope of the struggle against racism, the range and scope of the struggle against racism, and a grasp of the nature and scope of the struggle against racism demands an understanding of the nature and scope of the struggle for racism. There are people struggling for it at the precise moment that there are people struggling against it. And even more importantly, I would hold, coming to terms with the nature and scope of the struggle against racism, also requires an understanding of the nature and the scope of apathy concerning both. Apathy concerning the struggle against racism, and apathy concerning the struggle for racism. So with Gloria Richardson, what I've tried to do is reorient and maybe disorient in some ways what is a kind of classical schoolhouse-based understanding of the American civil rights movement and the struggle against racism in this country. Now I've done a little bit of that work for too long, for about 8 minutes now. And I want you to do a little bit of the work for maybe about 4 minutes now. And I'm going to start speaking a lot more quickly. Let's start with this for this work of orientation and reorientation. So believe me when I tell you that this picture here represents some central qualities of the American civil rights movement. You may have not seen it before, this photograph, but it is of a type that is classic, at least the part that we are focusing on now. And so for 30 seconds, what I hope that you would do with your shoulder mate, that's what elementary school teachers call the folks who are sitting beside you. They call them shoulder mates. What I'd like you to do for 30 seconds, because I think it will help us get a handle on what it means to face a history of racism. With your shoulder mate, I want you to discuss for 30 seconds, if you had to take this image and teach the history of the civil rights movement with this photograph, what might it teach well? If you had to raise questions about the movement and its chroniclers, what questions would this photo help you raise? 30 seconds with your shoulder mates. Y'all don't look excited about this. This is going to be the best part of the talk. Okay. Hey, Joanna, you don't have a shoulder mate. You got to get a shoulder mate. Yeah, that's right. All right, that's less than 30 seconds, but I talked too long to begin with. So I hope you found some, you started in a good way. What I find classic about this photograph is an attempt at righteousness in both a religious and a secular sense, I believe the photographer has captured. There's a plaintive groan that I almost hear coming from this. And I don't know what I think of that part. I don't know what purpose it serves to capture this young woman at this particular moment. And so I wonder about this plaintiveness. Who is the audience for it? Who is this plea going out toward? And I wonder about it in her mind, but I also wonder about it in the minds of folks who are looking at the photograph and in the minds of the photographer imagining who the primary audience of this photograph is. I would want to spend some time commenting on her hair, which I think is marvelous, on her clothes, which I think are on point, her jewelry, which I admire. And I have a question. I don't exactly know what she's doing. Let's draw out for just a second and take 15 seconds with a little more depth. You've already made some points with your shoulder mate. Now I've backed you up a few feet. What is added? Is anything added? 15 seconds with your shoulder mate. Oh, we don't have 15 seconds. I took too long. What I like about this, what this helps me do, and maybe it helps you do, now I think I know what she's doing. And the reason I think I might know what she's doing is because what I can see on the left of her. And what I see on the left, looks suspiciously like someone in prayer. So is she in prayer? The person to her left looks to be quietly praying. That happens sometimes in the places where I grew up. But what happened more times is the kind of prayer that I'm guessing could be happening here, which is a loud, a plaintive call. So maybe if this is a prayer, it's not necessarily a call to the person looking at the picture. It's a call beyond, or it could be a call beyond. Let's back up another few feet. Take 8 seconds with your shoulder mate. A little more dimension. Is anything added? Any further questions? 8 seconds, go. Okay, that's 5. 5 is good enough. We're going to go faster as we go on. I've got a contrast here that I don't know what to do with. I see possibly prayer in the middle, and I'm even more committed to prayer in the middle. If I back up just a little bit more, I see this young woman looks to be on her knees. And the man to her left is definitely praying. I'm holding that to a 98% confidence rate. But these folks to her right, what are they doing? If these two are in prayer, if this moment, whatever this moment is, calls for prayer for the person at the center and at the background of our photograph, these other folks near the foreground don't look to be praying at all. Let's back up a little bit more. And now we didn't back, we actually jumped. I'm taking a completely different shot of a larger photograph. Take 5 seconds. What does this part of the photograph add to what you and your shoulder mate think is what is going on and the questions that you have about it? Excellent work, y'all. Great work. So here's the entire photograph, and it's capturing a moment in a protest movement in the early 1960s in Birmingham, Alabama. And it is complex. It is rich. It is phenomenally deep. At the same moment where you have a young woman who looks to be calling out, praying to the beyond, and a gentleman to her left doing the same. You also have young people who look to be in play, in a kind of play, but I would argue probably a quite purposeful play. And this photograph, for me, in all of its richness, encapsulates an important aspect of the historiography, the developing and unfolding historiography of the civil rights movement, moving us from the kind of a kind of simple moral tale from an evil segregationist land and a struggle that then confronts that segregation and then produces a more moral place. And the folks who do this work are the great men and women of this country, but actually usually the great men of this country. This picture encapsulates the developments in the historiography of the civil rights movement that I think are critical for facing a history of racism. This photograph contains or begs, requires a deeper, more critical, more human, more difficult practice of interpretation, both more mythic and less mythic, depending on your definition of mythic, but more. It requires more of everything. When you have time, when you leave here, take a look at the trailer to HBO's documentary, King in the Wilderness. It encapsulates in that 2-minute trailer, watch the entire film, but it encapsulates in that 2-minute trailer the development of the historiography and the challenge against the schoolhouse myth that a lot of us grew up. I won't bring y'all in there. What I grew up with. And one of the main takeaways that you'll walk away from that trailer understanding is you'll walk away from it with a desire to understand how is it that King came to loom so large in our imaginations as Americans contemplating the civil rights movement. That's not to say he shouldn't loom large, but it's to say at his death, he was amongst the least popular American figures in the country. Not 30% of the American population thought King was on the right path when he died. And next month we'll be celebrating his birthday, we do every year. So how did that happen? How does a man go from being a pariah, and why was he a pariah, right? How did he go from being a pariah to someone who we honor in the ways that we do? Now I've got to really hurry. I got 25 minutes, and I can do it. I'm on page 9. I got 51 slides. All right, let's go. So one of the ways of addressing this change in historiography is captured by, I'm going to call her a historian, even though she's ended up in a department of political science. I love the political scientists. Y'all are great. But I'm going to call her historian. This work is quite historical. Her work is, this book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, is both captures the range of other people's recent writing on the civil rights movement and the direction that the work on the Black freedom struggle is going, and her particular research calling for, how she has put it, and I think this is almost perfect, a more beautiful and terrible history of the Black freedom struggle. We have leaned toward a helpful history of the Black freedom struggle, or a cute history of the Black freedom struggle. Professor Theo Harris is calling for a history that if you make it, if you acknowledge the ways that it is more terrible, it will also be more beautiful. What does it mean to do this, to go and find a more beautiful and terrible history? Well, one, it's you question the great man view of history. You inquire about the work of women and young people. Second, you pay attention to the great roadblocks in public life, particularly against the people who we sometimes see as co-conspirators in the movement, that the media and the pragmatists could be problematic, could be extraordinarily problematic. It's understanding that the obvious racists were never the biggest problem. The biggest roadblocks were never the people who would grab the Confederate flags and go out and march and keep people from entering recently desegregated schools. The bigger problems could and often did lie elsewhere. The other thing is to understand that the struggle, as some civil rights activists put it, was for more than a hamburger. The struggle was, though often posed as a struggle for access, was a struggle for equitable structures, for a citizenship and a moral economy and real peace. And also that the movement has a long history It matters that Gloria Richardson, though I've talked about her in the early 1960s, it matters that she went to Howard in the 1930s. It matters, for example, that the black community organized sharecroppers, particularly black communists in the 1930s, organized sharecroppers in Alabama in the 1930s. It matters that folks like Rosa Parks had grandparents and uncles who were active in the Garveyite movement in the early 20th century, that to understand the black freedom struggle as it unfolds in the 1960s requires a deep knowledge, probably all the way back into slavery, but at least into Reconstruction. And if you can't get into Reconstruction, you got to at least start in the late 19th century. Theo Harris also argues that we don't have the public history that we need of the civil rights movement. We don't have a public history that will help make possible or more robust civic life that we need. She would ask us, for example, to take advantage of, to take a close view at this stamp of, this Black Heritage stamp of Rosa Parks and of Martin Luther King and of Paul Robeson. And I love to look at, my father collected stamps, and he was into the Black Heritage stamp more than anything else. But this says courage, right? But what about this presentation of Parks actually speaks to her work, actually speaks to courage? Look at Paul Robeson. Now, I don't know how Paul Robeson got a stamp. If any of you know anything about Paul Robeson, you should be wondering how he got a stamp either. And if a whole lot of people got their way, he would never have gotten a stamp. But since he did get one, he'd have to get this one, given the stuff that Paul Robeson did. It would have to be an innocuous, smiling Paul Robeson placed on a stamp. King comes closer, though, in his first Black Heritage stamp to doing the kind of public work that Theo Harris would ask for. On the King stamp, there's at least an allusion to work, to civic life, to what it takes to make change in the country. Now, I love Black History Month, but Theo Harris says that we've got a lot of problems with Black History Month because they don't do these things that she's laid out as being important to a more beautiful and terrible history. Though I do have to get Oberlin their props here. I mean, on March 26th, they're having a Black People Are Infinity, the Black History Month ball. The Black People Are Infinity ball. I love that. And I love the fact that it's in March 26th. They're like, I don't care about your Black History Month. This is Black History Year. I should be pointing up there. So they're going a little farther. Theo Harris is not sure that our public monuments with things like darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that, will actually get us thinking about the work of civic life. And also whether our monumentality is a problem or an asset. I, for one, this is fine, but I'm particularly taken by the monument to King in the Atlanta airport. When you head up the escalators into the international terminal, you used to see a suit he wore in a glass case. And the first time I saw that suit, I said to myself, that is really small. That's a really small suit. And I was helped by that. Are we helped by this? Are we helped by this pose of Rosa Parks? Does this help us understand Rosa Parks? Or this? Pretend like you're at the optometrist. This or this? This or this? Which one speaks to the work she did better? What would a proper memorial to Parks look like? And while we're at it, if this is the work of civil rights, why don't we have monuments that look like this? What would a monument like this do for us that a monument like this can't do? What would this monument remind us? If I woke up on January 6th surprised, what would a monument like this have helped me understand about this country that I live in and love? What does this look at Rosa Parks tell us? You like that one? What would that monument do? What would that monument do? That versus that. What does this say about her life in America? What does that say about her life in America? How about this? You know, we do monuments like this sometimes, right? We do monuments like this sometimes. And I'd rather have the conversation about whether this actually speaks in the best way to that than whether we should have our monuments like that at all. This is Rosa Parks before she refuses to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery at Highlander Training School, noted for training folks how to cause good, real trouble in the United States. These are the young people back in Birmingham, both protesting and playing and fighting all at once. And that's Gloria Richardson, whose eyes we started with. And she's not here for your bayonet, and your violence, and your trouble, and your intimidation. How do we face racism the way Gloria Richardson did? So, in the 15 minutes that I have left, I'm going to try and do what I've attempted to do for the larger Black freedom struggle for our own lives here at this university. What does it look like to face racism at Rice in the same ways that historians of the Black freedom struggle have been moving to face racism in the United States, to tell stories, more beautiful and terrible stories. And the work that I'm going to speak to now comes out of the work of the Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Injustice, which is work that I have the honor of working on with my colleague Caleb McDaniel, who is in the back. Thanks, Caleb. And all of these folks as well, your colleagues here at the university. And I see some of you in the audience right now. So let's see, how do we do a more beautiful and terrible history of segregation and desegregation at our university? Now, this is not always simple work. It's usually pretty hard. Here's a first draft of Black history work at Rice. It's not really easy to put together. This is the state of things in 2004 when hardworking folks at the university are trying to figure out what was going on with the desegregation of the university? Who were even the first Black students and the first Black faculty at the university? And we get together, they're able to pull together this list that has 4 Black students on it as being the first Black students at the university. Charles Freeman, Jacqueline Elizabeth Macaulay, Theodore Henderson, and Linda Faye Williams. And then there are a few faculty who are listed. And among the students who are listed are Raymond Lewis Johnson, who's listed as the first Black student to come to Rice and the first Black student to graduate from Rice. The first Black faculty are given as 3 folks: Kennard Reed, who's in the math department in the mid-1960s, Robert Bell, who comes in the early 1970s, and Robert Jones in the English department. And so we have a sense of the origin story that is developing there. In 2010, 6 or so years later, the details of the story haven't changed that much, but the shape of it is becoming a little easier to grasp. Raymond Johnson is holding still pride of place as a person who shapes and defines a good deal of the history of desegregation at Rice. The 2 undergraduate freshmen, or I'm sorry, the 4 undergraduate students are listed, though there are some issues that begin to emerge from that material. If you read the paragraphs on the 4 undergraduate students, one of the things that you'll see, as it's put here, the first 2 don't graduate from Rice. The second 2 do. I would probably write that a little differently. Rice does not graduate the first 2 black students who are admitted to the university, but Rice does manage to graduate the second 2 students who earn admission to the university. If we're going to talk about this more beautiful and terrible history, I think it helps to maybe head back quickly to the 1930s to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who helped frame the question of, he helped us consider and grapple with some of the problematics of segregation and desegregation. And if we're to write a history that is both more beautiful and more terrible, it makes sense to start with his consideration of what was at stake in desegregation. And I've got 8 slides on this. I'm only going to read this one. Du Bois thought it was the refinement of cruelty to send black children into desegregating schools. It was the refinement of cruelty to send young people to war, is basically what he's saying. For grown folks to use children as battering rams, he thought could only bring damage to a young person's soul. Now, you don't have to believe all of that, and I don't believe all of that, but you do have to think about it. And if your consideration of desegregation and what it meant to be a pioneer or a trailblazer in a desegregating institution doesn't make room for the possibility of that fact, that you were sending young people into war zones, then we won't get very far on writing this more beautiful and terrible history. Raymond Johnson himself often troubled the waters on his history at the university. He understood or understands that a more beautiful and terrible history is necessary. If you stood next to Dr. Johnson too long when people were saying really nice things about him and really nice things about Rice, or if you listened to him in the interview that we did for the Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Injustice about his life at Rice, you'll recall that he often asks a question when people point out that he is the first African-American student to graduate with a PhD in math from the university. And the question that he will ask is, ask them how many the university has graduated since me. And when I first heard that question, I was blown away. I was like, what, 8, 9, 7? And the first time he asked it of me, the number was 0. And when he asked it 3 or 4 years ago when we interviewed him, the number was still 0. And so if your understanding of what it meant to be a pioneering student at Rice University can't handle at the same time that after Dr. Johnson's graduation from the university, for decades, not another black student was graduated in math from the university, then we won't get to a more beautiful and terrible history. I've got 5 or so more minutes, so here I go. Let's do some of that work now. So also in the archives, we can find this file that lists that Negro students at Rice in '67. And I'm going to concentrate on the one on the right because it's a little easier to take a look at. But when you look at that, I hope you're a little bit surprised, because one of the things that happens is a few black graduate students pop up. And if you look under the math part, something quite interesting. I'm not quite sure about what's going on with the indention under math, but could there be 2 black graduate students in the math department in the early 1960s? Raymond Johnson, Velma Williams, look to be there at the same time. There's a student who's listed as black on this memo in civil engineering, N.C. Mogbo. There's a student in Germanics, James McLeod. Who are these folks? And what do their stories mean for our understanding of the trajectory of desegregation at Rice? There are even some stories we can't even know. There are 5 black students who are admitted to the university when it opens up, when it desegregates and opens up. There are 5 who are admitted, but 2 come. What about those other 3, and what do their stories tell us? We don't know much about James McLeod, but if you are a student or know folks at Washington University in St. Louis, everyone there knows something about him. Everyone knows something about James McLeod at Washington University. They think they have a better undergraduate program than we do at WashU. I want to be clear. And I'm not commenting on that, but they think they have a better undergraduate program than we do, and there's no one that they credit more for that excellence than James McLeod. And we know almost nothing about him and his life and his experience here. And so what would his story tell us? If you're on the WashU campus, you can walk through James McLeod Way, right? He's passed now, and so they've dedicated a part of the university to him. This is Velma McAfee Williams, that math student who is listed as being at the university at the same time, at the same time as Raymond Johnson. And that's her last week, sitting in my office, hanging out, chilling. No one laughed at that. I thought that was funny. With a lot of equipment, telling something about her story. I'm asking her, oh, wait a minute. So this one says I'm out of time, but this one says I got 5 minutes. Which one's right? I got 5 minutes. Excellent. Watch this. So how does Velma McAfee Williams get to Rice? Well, it starts in a place we can't even begin with. It starts in Wiley, Texas, where she majors in Marshall, Texas, where she majors in math at Wiley College. She ends up teaching math at Texas Southern University after doing some teaching at Wiley. And then in the 1960s, while teaching at Texas Southern University, she gets involved in a program that sends black teachers to the University of Wisconsin to refine some of their teaching skills. While there, she works with some Rice professors who are also there. After her first year, she's called back with a smaller number of people to continue upper math studies, high-level math studies at the University of Wisconsin. And it's her hope to come to Wisconsin as a graduate student. But she can't figure out how to do it because she has kids and a partner. And so one of the faculty at Wisconsin who knows that Rice is desegregated says, well, why don't you try Rice? And so she does. She applies for Rice in 1966, enters as a part-time student, begins full-time work in 1967. By the time she arrives at Rice, she's got a degree in math from Wiley. She's got a master's in math from DePaul University. She's worked for years on radiation shielding. I don't know what that is, at the Argonne National Laboratory. And she shows up in Rice in 1966 to get her PhD. And there is a beautiful, beautiful part of this story. This is an article that she wrote with some of her colleagues at Texas Southern on some of the pragmatic aspects of teaching a wide range of students with wide range of mathematical abilities at Texas Southern. So she shows up at Rice with decades of teaching experience. She's teaching at Wiley days, weeks after she gives birth to some of her children. She's so loved at Wiley that they bring students to her in between nursing children so she can teach math to them, because they had a professor on leave. At Rice, there is a moment where she's working with one of her senior faculty and a group of graders in the math department, and the professor calls them together, and he chastises all the men in the room for the shoddy grading that they've done. And then the professor points out Miss McAfee Williams and says, "This is how you grade math papers." And of course, she knew how to teach. She knew that grading was part of teaching, but it terrified her to be called out in that way. What's marvelous, what's also beautiful about this is there's a moment in the history of this university when there are 2 African-American PhD students and 1 black faculty member in the math department in 1966. It's a profoundly positive moment, potential-filled moment in the history of the university. But the black faculty member, Kennard Jones from Texas Southern University, is gone the next year. Raymond Johnson's advisor leaves 2 or 3 years after his time on campus, and Johnson follows him to Chicago. And that leaves Velma McAfee Williams here, a lone black woman student. Do you understand that she's a different kind of student, right? She's in her 40s. She's a contemporary of Gloria Richardson. She's in her 40s when these young people are in their 20s. She's getting a math PhD while she's raising her kids. She's leaving them in the RMC while she's doing her homework. There are white men in the math class who make sure that they put their jackets on chairs so that she doesn't sit next to them. And the most terrible part of this beautiful and more terrible history is when the moment when she takes her 3rd exam in the math department. She has a phenomenal struggle getting an advisor, a story that is long and complicated. But in her final exam, one guy stands out on the porch and never comes in. Another professor, she indicates, leaves the exam early. And the professor who writes the exam calls her later and says, "We're prepared to give you a Master's of Arts in Math." And Miss McAfee Williams says, "I have a Master's in Math from DePaul University. I'm not at Rice to get a Master's." And so she finds herself at her wit's end. She pushes one more time at Rice. A fellow student thinks that there's a way, that there's a professor who will work with her, and he directs her to this professor. She asks the professor if she can sit in on his class for a year or for a semester, which he does. But during that time, the professor never says a single word to her. And at the end of the semester, she waits for him outside the classroom and says, "You know, I don't know that people understand how hard it is when you treat them as if they do not exist." And that ended her time at Rice. And tragedy upon tragedies, terrible history, more beautiful and terrible history on more beautiful and terrible history. Dr. Johnson has no idea that there was another black student in the math department at the same time that she was. Tragedy upon tragedies, terrible history upon terrible history. It's not until 2010 that her children know that she ever attended Rice. She says she spent the entire time trying to forget Rice. So what does it mean to hold both of these stories together at once and trying to come to terms with the history of desegregation at our university? I've taken 2 extra minutes, but I want to thank Seiichi Matsuda, the Dale Butcher Professor of Chemistry and History, as far as I'm concerned, because Dr. Matsuda has done more than anyone else to help bring this story to folks here at Rice. And so what does it mean? What does this mean? We'll see. We'll see. But how it unfolds, I think, will tell us a great deal about what it means for this university to face a history of racism.
The first monument to racism I saw in the United States was when I visited Texas for the first time in 1986. I visited the Texas Capitol, and there is a monument there for the unknown soldier, or nameless soldier. And, you know, having served in the military, I have, you know, soldiers get drafted, but the inscription was, to the unnamed soldier of the Civil War who fought for a just cause and lost. And I remember staying there just speechless, that in 1986, I didn't know anything there about the lost cause ideology or anything like that. I just stood there in shock that this is written down in stone on the grounds of the Texas Capitol. That to me is a monument to racism.
Florida with regard to CRT and voting rights, et cetera. And right, as someone who teaches African American history, I have to work really hard not to not see parallels, but to see a long struggle, right? Parallels for me suggest that things have different origins and are headed in different, or headed in the same direction, but aren't fundamentally connected. As a historian, this is a long story, right? It's a continuation of the story. And a lot of these battles, of course, have always been fought out in schools and in politics, particularly around voting. Thank you.
Dr. Byrd, thanks for your presentation. I have a question. We're celebrating our first, sure, absolutely. We're celebrating our first Black president who comes from engineering, which is my school of discipline. So we're seeing change at the top. Change in the middle is more difficult. when it comes to diversifying faculty, as well as graduate student opportunities. Do you have any insights or suggestions on, how we can address some of the disparities that still exist, especially in the STEM disciplines, for future doctoral candidates, faculty, where decisions are being made within the departments versus at the higher levels?
So I'm going to answer that story, the question as a historian first, and maybe only as a historian. And I think when it comes to facing a history of racism, what can be critically important is, again, these are connected, right? We're only talking a lifetime of 50 or so years, and so how does change happen in a department historically, right? How does Kennard Reed get to the math department? Like, we don't keep him, the university doesn't keep him, but how does he get there? How are 2 black graduate students recruited in the late 1960s? What is the relationship between departments who start early in the work and have early success and early failure, success and failure in recruiting, retaining, and developing black faculty? What's the relationship between those departments that have early success and failure and where they are now, right? I think as a historian, those are all questions that if you follow them, they can lead to fruitful answers. You're asking for an answer, and I think there are a lot of directions and answers to be found in facing the history. And I may be I'm going to sit down, and Caleb's going to say I was being too oblique, but right. So, right, there are postdoctoral programs in the university that fail and succeed early for the recruiting of black graduate students. But that early failure and success helps departments over time. I don't know how firm I want to be on that. But there are several directions that we can go from by paying attention to early success and failure.
And I appreciate your response, because what I'm hearing is document the narratives of those experiences and share them with others for awareness, for lessons learned in behavior change.
Yeah. Well, sometimes not behavior change, but it builds capacity for future work. So how does Velma McAfee Williams get to Rice? The president of Texas Southern writes a grant to the Carnegie Foundation because there's interest at Wisconsin for collaborations that will build capacity for black professors. And she gets caught up in this network, and her desires and this movement to build capacity results in an opportunity.
Great, thank you.
I feel like,
Well, there's one in the back.
I feel like the problem, okay, you go ahead since you're way up there. Go ahead. You want to? Okay. I said that I'm even shocked. I don't get out into forums a lot. I feel like a lot of the people in the world probably feel like me. It's like, oh, we're still talking about it? Let me tell you why. Because I feel like a lot of the people have said that greenhouse gas is impossible to change because it's entrenched in us to be greedy and to be happy with our own. I feel like racism is so entrenched that the majority of the people have said, oh, well, so how do you just accept the fact that that monster can't die? And you got to just figure out how to float in it and keep your children safe. And I'm not mad. I know y'all think I'm probably one of the real radical blacks. I'm not. I feel like it's just the way that the majority of us have said, okay, the monster is everywhere. How do you save your kids? And I don't see him as the monster. I don't see anyone in here as the monster. I see racism looking for the blacks everywhere. It's not something I literally can see. It's something I see when I go to the schools, feel when I go to everywhere I go. That thing is there, but he didn't do it. She didn't do it. What is this monster? What is this thing that makes me, like he said about the thermostat in the house? What is it? I say, I want the temperature to be 74. She said, I want it to be 73. But everybody got a different temperature that they want to be comfortable. We all want to be comfortable, but everything is different that makes everybody comfortable. Yet, we want to be comfortable, but everybody is not comfortable. So with racism, how do you set a comfortable temperature that is not comfortable for everyone? How do you set something there that is going to be comfortable? Like, you got to deal with it, no matter if you're comfortable or not. This is how things got to look, because somebody is suffering. So you got to just set the bar right here, and no race, nobody, because none of the dynamics in America are the same as it was when racism started. Like I said, it's a monster, and I don't know what to do with it. Neither do you, right?
So Gloria Richardson thought she knew what to do with it, and I think there's something to be gained by listening to and I mean, all my answers are historian answers, right? But there are people who thought they knew what to do about it, and I think listening critically to those folks can be helpful. Thank you.